A 10-year-old girl rushed into the hospital, cradling a newborn baby tightly in her arms. When the doctors took a closer look, they were stunned, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. How was this even possible? How could little girl have given birth? What happened to this little girl? The sun barely peeked over the horizon as Mariana, a seasoned nurse at Martin's Hope Hospital, stepped into the sterile halls. The early morning air was crisp and still, save for the occasional rustle of curtains swaying in the faint draught of the hallway. It was a quiet shift, the kind that lulled you into a false sense of calm before the storm. Mariana had been here long enough to know how deceptive the silence could be. The hospital, nestled in the heart of the town, had an almost sacred aura in the morning hours. The walls, bathed in pale blue light, hummed softly with the machinery that never slept. The smell of disinfectant was a familiar, almost comforting scent to her by now. Yet the peace of the moment was fragile, always on the edge of breaking. Suddenly, the automatic doors at the entrance slid open with a faint hiss. Mariana turned instinctively, her tired eyes landing on a small figure standing in the doorway. Mariana's heart skipped a beat, sensing the tension that seemed to radiate off the child. A girl, no older than 10, clutching something tight to her chest. Her clothes, an old faded t-shirt and loose pants, looked like they had been hastily thrown on. But what caught Mariana's breath, what made her legs feel suddenly heavy, was the bundle in the girl's arms. A newborn. The baby was still wrapped in a tattered blanket, its tiny form barely visible except for the soft tufts of dark hair peeking through. "Oh my God," Mariana muttered under her breath, moving swiftly toward the girl. She could see the face now, pale, drawn with exhaustion and something far more unsettling fear. The kind of fear that wasn't natural for a child, her age. The girl's arms were trembling as she held onto the baby, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the ground. "Hey, sweetheart," Mariana said softly, bending down to see the little girl gaze. "Are you all right? What's your name?" Her lips quivered. Her eyes, wide and dark, darted around the room as if searching for someone, or maybe an escape. She didn't answer at first, just stood there clutching the baby tighter, her breathing quick and shallow. "My name's Lucia," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible, like a confession to something far greater than just a name. Mariana's heart clenched. "It's okay, Lucia. You're safe here," she said gently. "Let me help you, honey. Can I take a look at the baby?" Lucia shook her head vigorously, stepping back, her grip tightening even more around the small, fragile form in her arms. "No, please don't take him." Mariana nodded slowly, understanding the delicate balance she was walking on now. "All right, sweetheart. We won't take him, I promise. But you both need help, okay? We need to make sure you're both okay." Lucia blinked, her small face creasing in confusion, but she didn't resist as Mariana carefully led her to one of the nearby examination rooms. She kept her promise, never letting go of the baby. Within moments, Dr. Mitchell entered, his expression as solemn as ever. He was a man of few words, but his eyes held compassion as he glanced between the child and the newborn. Mariana could feel his silent concern, the unspoken questions that weighed heavy in the air, but neither of them said anything. The baby was still quiet, eerily so, as if sensing the tension that surrounded them. It lay in Lucia's arms, tiny and fragile, its umbilical cord still attached, a grim reminder of how recent this birth had been. Mariana shared a brief, worried glance with Dr. Mitchell. It was clear this wasn't just a medical emergency. This was something deeper, something far more painful than they had anticipated. "Lucia," Dr. Mitchell began in a soft voice, kneeling beside her, "we're going to help you, but I need to check on the baby. Is that okay?" Lucia hesitated again, her lips pressing into a tight line. She was holding back tears, that much was clear. But after a long, agonizing pause, she nodded, though her arms never fully released the baby. The room was silent as they worked, the usual flurry of medical urgency tempered by the quiet fear that surrounded this fragile child. Mariana couldn't shake the feeling of dread that crept up her spine. Whatever had brought Lucia here, it was something that no 10-year-old should ever have to face. As Dr. Mitchell began the examination, Mariana remained close, her presence a steady comfort for the young girl. She could see the weight of the world pressing down on Lucia's small shoulders, but there were no words that could break the silence just yet. And so they worked in that heavy, haunting quiet, knowing that the worst was still to come. Lucia sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her small frame trembling as she held the baby closer to her chest. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of machines and the distant whispers of hospital staff just outside the door. Her dark hair, unkempt and matted, fell over her face, partially hiding the tears that clung to her lashes. She couldn't let them see her cry. Not now, not here. If she cried, they might take him away. And that was the one thing she couldn't bear. Dr. Mitchell, a middle-aged man with greying hair and soft eyes, stood at the foot of the bed. His tone was gentle, though his words carried a weight that made Lucia's heart pound. He had been asking questions for what felt like hours, but each one felt heavier than the last. "Lucia, sweetheart, we're just trying to understand what happened, Doctor," Mitchell said, his voice as soft as the creak of the old chair he leaned against. "We need to know if there's someone we should call. Is there anyone at home we can talk to?" Mariana, the young nurse who had been at her side since she arrived, sat down next to her, the bed dipping slightly under her weight. Mariana's presence was like a warm blanket in the middle of a storm. She hadn't asked the hard questions, not like Dr. Mitchell. She just stayed close, offering a calm that Lucia clung to. "You're safe here," Mariana whispered, reaching out to gently brush a strand of hair from Lucia's face. "No one is going to hurt you. We're just trying to help." Lucia wanted to believe her. She really did, but the fear, the suffocating fear, wrapped around her like a cold chain she couldn't shake. She pressed her face against the baby's head, breathing in the faint, milky smell that reminded her of why she had to stay quiet. If she said too much, if she gave them even a hint, they might take him away. And without him, she had nothing. No family, no home, just him. The door creaked open slightly, and a new voice entered the room, softer but firm. Bella, the social worker, stepped inside, her smile as kind as the pink sweater she wore. "Lucia, I'm Bella. I just want to talk for a little while, okay?" she said, sitting in the chair Dr. Mitchell had vacated. "There's no pressure. I just want to help." Lucia bit her lip, her eyes darting to Mariana for reassurance. She didn't know Bella. She didn't know if she could trust her, not yet. But the nurse gave her a nod, a subtle gesture that said, "It's okay. You're not alone. Do you want to tell me about your family?" Bella continued, her tone light, as if she were asking something as simple as the weather outside. "Is there anyone at home waiting for you? Your mum, maybe?" At the mention of her mother, Lucia's body tensed. Her mum had left a long time ago. Too long. She wasn't coming back. Lucia knew that now. She had waited, hoped, prayed for her to return, but deep down she knew. She's not coming back. "No," Lucia finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "She's gone." Bella nodded as if she had expected that. "And your stepfather? Is he around?" Lucia's breath hitched. She could feel the room closing in around her, the walls pressing in like they knew what she was hiding. Her heart raced, and she squeezed her eyes shut, willing the question to disappear. But Bella's words lingered in the air, heavy and impossible to escape. "No," Lucia choked out. It wasn't a lie. Not really. He wasn't here right now. She didn't know where he was. She didn't want to know. Bella leaned forward, her eyes soft and understanding. "Okay, Lucia, we won't push, but we do need to make sure you and the baby are safe. We're here for you, all right?" Lucia didn't respond. She couldn't. The fear was too strong, wrapping tighter around her throat, suffocating the words before they could form. She only nodded, her eyes dropping to the baby once more. As long as he's safe, she thought. That's all that matters. Outside, the murmurs of the hospital staff grew louder. Lucia could hear little bits of conversations, words like strange and 10 years old. They didn't know. They couldn't know. If they knew, everything would be over. Mariana placed a hand on Lucia's shoulder, giving her a gentle squeeze. "You're doing great, Lucia. We're going to take care of you." But even with Mariana's warmth, the fear didn't fade. It sat there, a constant weight in her chest, as she wondered if this was the moment everything would change, if this was the moment they would take him away. Dr. Mitchell sat quietly in the corner of the room, his posture relaxed, but his gaze attentive. He had dealt with difficult cases before, but something about this one, the fragile girl sitting in front of him, clutching the newborn, felt different. He had learned over the years to be patient, to wait for the cracks in the silence to widen just enough for the truth to seep through. So, he didn't push. Instead, he waited, allowing the sterile hum of the hospital room to settle over them like a thin blanket. Lucia sat on the edge of the bed, her back hunched, her thin arms wrapped protectively around the baby. The blanket cradling the child was threadbare, a dull grey that matched the overcast sky outside. She didn't look up, her eyes fixed on a single spot on the floor, as if everything she needed to say was trapped there. Her breath came out in shallow bursts, and Dr. Mitchell noticed the slight tremor in her hands. He exchanged a glance with Mariana, who sat by Lucia's side, her presence calm and steady. There was an unspoken understanding between them. This would take time. "Lucia," Dr. Mitchell began, his voice low and steady, "I know it's hard, but we need to know what happened. It's the only way we can help you and the baby." He paused, letting his words settle, giving them weight. "You're safe here. No one is going to hurt you." Lucia's grip tightened on the child, the fabric of the blanket twisting beneath her fingers. For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't respond, like she would remain locked in her own world, unreachable. But then, slowly, her lips parted, and a soft, broken whisper escaped. "I woke up, and he was there." Her words hung in the air, fragile and confusing. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing in concern. He didn't press. He knew better than to jump in too quickly, knew how delicate these moments were. Lucia's gaze remained fixed on the floor. It hurt. A lot. I didn't know why. I didn't ask for it. Her voice trembled with each word, as though speaking them aloud made them real, too real. "I don't know how it happened, but I woke up, and the baby was there." Mariana gently reached for Lucia's hand, her touch light but reassuring. "It's okay," she whispered, even though it clearly wasn't. "You're doing great." Lucia blinked hard, fighting the tears that threatened to spill over. Her breathing hitched uneven, as if every breath was a struggle against the memories trying to break through. And then, without warning, the words tumbled out, disjointed and raw. "My stepfather, he hurt me," she stammered. Her body shook violently now, as though every muscle in her small frame was trying to escape the truth. He came into my room. I didn't understand. I didn't want it to happen. The room seemed to freeze. Dr. Mitchell felt a knot tighten in his chest. So, it was what they feared. Bella, the social worker, had been standing quietly by the door, but now she stepped forward, her face pale with shock. She and Dr. Mitchell exchanged a silent, heavy look. This was no longer a matter of simple concern. This was a serious case of abuse, deep, ongoing, and likely far worse than they had initially imagined. Bella moved closer, kneeling beside Mariana, her voice soft but firm. "Lucia, we're here to help you. No one is going to hurt you anymore. We're going to make sure of that." Lucia's eyes finally lifted from the floor, meeting Bella's for the briefest moment before darting away. She looked like a cornered animal, terrified of trusting anyone, terrified of what might happen if she let herself believe the words. She shook her head as if trying to clear away the fog of fear, but it clung to her, heavy and oppressive. "I don't want to lose him," she whispered, glancing down at the baby in her arms. "He's the only thing I have." Mariana gently wrapped an arm around Lucia's shoulders, pulling her in close. "You're not going to lose him," she murmured. "We're going to keep you both safe." But even as the words left Mariana's lips, Lucia's sobs began to break free, silent at first, then rising into sharp, pained cries. She clung to the baby even tighter, as though he were the only thing anchoring her to this world, the only thing preventing her from disappearing into the trauma that now seemed so inescapable. Dr. Mitchell stood, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just witnessed. There would be so many steps to take, now police reports, medical tests, long conversations with social services. But for now, all he could do was let Lucia cry, let her release the flood of emotion she had clearly been holding in for so long. As the sobs echoed through the small hospital room, Bella and Dr. Mitchell exchanged one last look, a silent understanding passing between them. This was only the beginning. The truth had been revealed, but the road ahead would be long and painful. Lucia had finally spoken, but her journey was far from over. The hospital halls, once quiet and orderly, were now a hub of tense activity. The soft click of heels on the tile floor and the murmur of voices filled the air as police officers and social workers arrived, their presence unmistakable. It had only been a few hours since Lucia's shocking confession, but the wheels of justice were already turning. They had to move quickly now, before the situation spiraled further out of control. Dr. Mitchell watched from his office window as two police officers stepped into the lobby. Their uniforms were sharp, their faces serious. He knew this wasn't going to be a simple investigation. Cases like this never were. He sighed, running a hand through his greying hair before making his way down the hall toward Lucia's room. In the small hospital room, Lucia sat curled up in a chair near the window, the baby still in her arms. She hadn't let him go since she arrived, not even for a moment. Her eyes were tired, hollow, and her body looked even smaller beneath the weight of everything that had happened. Mariana was by her side, as always, a steady presence in the storm of uncertainty that surrounded them both. The door opened quietly, and Dr. Mitchell stepped inside, followed by Bella, the social worker who had been handling Lucia's case. Behind them, the officers entered, their expressions carefully neutral. They were here to gather evidence, to take the next steps in the investigation. But even as they stood there, strong and authoritative, there was a palpable sense of discomfort. This wasn't just another case to them either. "Lucia," Dr. Mitchell said gently, kneeling beside her. "The police are here. They need to ask you a few more questions, and they're going to look through your medical records. But I promise you, they're here to help. No one is going to hurt you anymore." Lucia's grip tightened on the baby, her eyes darting toward the officers. She didn't say anything, but her body tensed visibly, a clear sign of her fear. Mariana leaned in closer, brushing a stray lock of hair from Lucia's face. "It's okay," Mariana whispered softly, her voice full of warmth. "I'll be right here with you the whole time. You're not alone." Lucia nodded slightly, though her gaze stayed fixed on the floor. The baby, blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding him, shifted slightly in her arms, his tiny hand grasping the edge of the blanket. For a moment, it seemed like he was the only thing anchoring her to this reality. As the officers began to quietly discuss the next steps with Dr. Mitchell, Bella moved to the window, her eyes scanning the hospital grounds. They had been trying to locate Lucia's mother since the confession, but so far there had been no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished without a trace. Bella frowned, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about Lucia's stepfather anymore. The absence of her mother added another layer of complexity to the case. "We'll keep searching," one of the officers assured Bella, catching her concerned expression. "We'll find her eventually. It's just a matter of time." Bella nodded, though her face remained tense. Time, she thought. How much more time does Lucia have before everything falls apart? Outside, the legal team gathered. Dr. Mitchell, Bella, and the police officers exchanged serious glances. The situation was becoming more complicated by the minute. Lucia's age, the abuse, the missing mother, it all added layers of urgency. They had to move fast, not only to protect Lucia, but also to prevent further emotional damage. "She's fragile," Bella said, her voice low, almost as if she were talking to herself. "We need to handle this with care. Too much, too fast, and she might break. She'll need more medical exams," Dr. Mitchell added, his brow furrowed. "We need to document everything, but those tests, they're going to be hard on her. She's already been through enough." The police officer nodded, but his focus was on the case ahead. "We don't have much time. If we're going to charge her stepfather, we need everything we can get. Her statement, the medical evidence, it all needs to be airtight." Bella sighed, glancing back toward the room where Lucia sat, still cradling Mike like he was the last piece of her world. How much more could she handle? "We'll have to be careful," Bella said, her voice resolute. "We can't push her too hard, but we have to act. She needs protection, and we need to get her to a safe place." Inside, Mariana watched over Lucia, her heart heavy with the weight of it all. She could see the exhaustion in the girl's face, the way her body seemed to sag under the pressure of everything. But in the way Lucia held Mike so fiercely, so protectively, Mariana also saw something else. Strength. Lucia sat by the hospital window, the soft morning light filtering through the pale curtains, casting a gentle glow on her and Mike. The baby lay in her lap, his tiny fingers curling around a piece of her hair as she gently rocked him back and forth. It was a motion that had become second nature to her now. The nurses didn't even need to remind her anymore. She knew when he needed feeding, when his diaper needed changing, and she could soothe his cries better than anyone else in the hospital. It surprised them all. How could a 10-year-old girl be so naturally maternal? "Lucia, you're doing great, sweetheart," Carmen, the young nurse, said as she entered the room with a warm smile. She was carrying a small stuffed bear, its fur soft and worn, clearly a token of comfort for Mike. "Look what I found for Mike." Lucia looked up, her dark eyes still clouded with a mixture of exhaustion and worry, but she managed a small smile. "For Mike?" she asked, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. She took the bear from Carmen's outstretched hand and carefully placed it beside the baby. Mike wiggled slightly, letting out a soft coo as if he approved of the new toy. "He's lucky to have you. You know that?" Carmen added, sitting down beside Lucia. She watched as the little girl adjusted the baby in her lap, making sure he was comfortable. Lucia said nothing, her attention solely on the baby, but inside, her heart was heavy. Was she really doing a good job? Everyone kept telling her she was, but it didn't feel that way. The memories of her stepfather, the shame, the fear, they clung to her like shadows she couldn't shake. Every time she looked at Mike, she felt a pang of guilt deep inside her chest. "He's all I have," Lucia whispered after a long pause. She glanced up at Carmen, her eyes wet but determined. "I have to take care of him." Carmen's smile faded and her gaze softened. She knew there was more behind those words than Lucia was letting on. "You're not alone, Lucia. We're all here to help you and Mike. You're not carrying this by yourself." Lucia nodded, but the worry remained etched across her small face. She appreciated Carmen's kindness, the way the nurses and even the doctors treated her like she was something fragile, something in need of protection. But no one understood what it was like to live with that fear gnawing away at her insides, the fear of losing Mike. As the days passed, the bond between Lucia and Mike grew stronger, and with it, so did her anxiety. She couldn't imagine her life without him now. The thought of being separated from him, of him being taken away, terrified her. She knew she wasn't supposed to think that way. They wouldn't take him away, right? But still, the fear lingered. One afternoon, Mariana, the older nurse who had been with Lucia since her first day at the hospital, came into the room. She sat down beside Lucia, watching the girl cradle Mike as if the baby was the only thing keeping her grounded in the world. "Lucia," Mariana began gently, "you're a wonderful mother. You really are. Look at how much love and care you're giving Mike." Lucia bit her lip, her gaze fixed on the baby. "But what if I'm not good enough? What if they take him away?" Her voice was barely audible, trembling with the weight of her fear. Mariana's heart sank. She had seen this before, the fear of abandonment, the uncertainty of the future. She placed a reassuring hand on Lucia's shoulder. "You're more than good enough. You love Mike, and that's what matters most. You're doing everything you can for him." "But what happens next?" Lucia asked, her voice cracking. She looked up at Mariana, her eyes wide and pleading. What if they make me leave him? He's the only thing I can hold on to." Mariana sighed softly, feeling the weight of the girl's words. "I don't have all the answers, Lucia, but I do know one thing. Right now, you and Mike are safe here. We're going to do everything we can to make sure you stay together. But it's going to take time, and there are things we'll have to figure out along the way." Lucia nodded slowly, but the fear didn't leave her eyes. She knew that Mariana was telling the truth, but the uncertainty was unbearable. She looked down at Mike, the baby now fast asleep in her arms, and whispered, "I don't want to lose him. He's the only thing that makes me feel okay." Mariana squeezed her shoulder gently. "You won't lose him. Not if we can help it." As the evening drew in, Lucia continued to hold Mike close, feeling the soft rise and fall of his chest as he slept. She knew that tomorrow might bring more questions, more uncertainty, but for now, in this quiet moment, she had him, and that had to be enough. Lucia sat on the hospital bed, her body tense, her arms wrapped protectively around Mike. She'd gotten used to this routine, the nurses coming in, offering warm smiles, asking how she was feeling. But today was different. Today, Bella, the social worker who had been with her since the beginning, had said there was someone special coming to see her, someone who wanted to help. "Lucia," Bella began as she opened the door softly. She stepped into the room, followed by a woman with kind eyes and soft graying hair. "This is Mrs. Rosie. She's from a foster family that specializes in caring for children like you and Mike." Lucia's eyes darted from Bella to the woman standing beside her. Mrs. Rosie had a gentle smile on her face, her hands clasped together in front of her. She wore a simple cardigan and jeans, looking more like someone's grandma than anything else. But Lucia had learned to be cautious. Kind faces didn't always mean safety, and the thought of anyone taking Mike away from her made her heart race. "Hi, Lucia," Mrs. Rosie said softly, taking a step closer but keeping her distance, as if she knew better than to push. "I've heard so much about you and little Mike here. You must be such a strong girl to take care of him like this." Lucia didn't respond. Her grip on Mike tightened, the familiar fear creeping into her chest. What did this lady really want? Was she just like the others, coming to talk and smile, only to leave her with more questions and more uncertainty? "I'm not going to take him away," Mrs. Rosie added quickly, sensing the tension in the room. "I just wanted to see how you're doing, and to let you know that if you're ready, there's a place in my home for both of you. You wouldn't be separated. Not at all." Lucia's eyes flickered with doubt. She had heard promises before promises that things would get better, that she would be safe, and they never lasted. But there was something in the way Mrs. Rosie spoke, something about how she didn't rush, how she let the silence linger, that made Lucia pause. "I have some pictures, if you'd like to see them," Mrs. Rosie said, slowly reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small photo album, the cover worn from use. "It's just my home. Nothing fancy, but it's cozy. We've got a big backyard and there's a playroom for the kids." She opened the album and held it out so Lucia could see the pictures. The first one showed a small, sunny kitchen with yellow curtains and a wooden table. Another photo revealed a green backyard with a swing hanging from a tree and a garden full of flowers. There were pictures of other kids, all smiling, playing, or eating together at the table. For the first time, Lucia felt something shift inside her. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something close to curiosity, something warmer than the cold wall of fear she had built around herself. The idea of a home, of a place where she and Mike could be together without the sterile smell of hospital antiseptic, seemed almost too good to be true. "I'm not like the others, Lucia," Mrs. Rosie said gently. "I've worked with kids who've been through tough times. You've been through more than most, and I want to help, but only if you're ready." Lucia glanced down at Mike, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. She could feel the weight of him, his soft breathing against her chest, and for a moment she let herself imagine what it would be like to live in that house, to sit at that table with the yellow curtains, to swing in the backyard while Mike played nearby. But then the fear crept back. What if it wasn't real? What if they promised her all these things, only to take Mike away later? The thought made her stomach twist. "I don't want to leave him," Lucia finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "You won't have to," Mrs. Rosie assured her, her voice steady. "You can both come. It'll be your choice. You'll have time to decide, and I'll make sure you're both together." Lucia looked up, her eyes meeting Mrs. Rosie's for the first time. There was something in the woman's eyes, something calm, something honest. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was enough to plant a small seed of hope in Lucia's heart. "Can we stay together?" Lucia asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. "In your house? Both of us?" Mrs. Rosie smiled warmly, her eyes softening. "Yes, sweetheart. Both of you. You'll stay together. At least for now, until you're ready for whatever comes next." Lucia nodded slowly, the tiniest flicker of trust beginning to form. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Maybe there was a chance for something better, for her and for Mike. The news came in the early afternoon. Lucia sat quietly in the corner of the hospital room, her knees tucked under her chin, as Bella, the social worker, entered with a solemn expression. Dr. Mitchell and Mariana were already there, standing nearby as though they had been waiting for this very moment. The air in the room shifted, growing heavier with every second, as Bella took a seat beside Lucia, her voice steady but soft. "Lucia," Bella began, choosing her words carefully, "they've arrested your stepfather. He was caught trying to flee the state." Lucia felt her body tense, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't seen him in weeks, but his presence had loomed large in her thoughts. A shadow she couldn't shake. And now the shadow had been ripped away, leaving behind only fear and uncertainty. She blinked, her vision blurring as her eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. "He's gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The knot in her stomach tightened. There was relief, yes, but it was tangled with something else. Fear that somehow, even from behind bars, he could reach her. Fear that his hold on her wasn't truly broken. Bella nodded. "He won't be able to hurt you anymore. The police have him, and they're working on the charges. You're safe, Lucia." Safe. The word sounded foreign, like it didn't belong to her. She wanted to believe it, wanted to wrap herself in the comfort of that idea. But her body refused to relax. Her mind wouldn't let her. What if he finds a way? The thought spiraled through her, each repetition darker than the last. Mariana noticed Lucia's growing distress, stepping closer and resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He's not coming back, Lucia. You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore." Lucia swallowed hard, her chest tightening with the weight of their words. "But what if he tries? What if he gets out?" Dr. Mitchell, who had been standing silently in the background, took a seat across from her, his expression calm and steady. "He won't, Lucia," he assured her, his voice firm. "And even if he did, we'll be here to protect you. You don't have to go through this alone." For a brief moment, Lucia's eyes flickered toward Dr. Mitchell. His calm presence had been a constant since the moment she'd arrived at the hospital, and somehow, in his words, she found a small thread of solace. She nodded, though her hands still shook. "There's something else we need to talk about," Bella continued, her tone gentle but serious. "The legal team is going to need your testimony, Lucia. I know this is difficult, but your voice is important in bringing justice to this situation." Lucia's heart sank. Testifying meant reliving it all, every painful detail, every moment of fear. The thought of speaking those words out loud, of seeing strangers' faces as they heard her story, made her want to shrink back into herself, to disappear. I don't think I can," she whispered, shaking her head. Her chest tightened, the walls of the room seeming to close in around her. Mariana knelt beside her, her voice soothing. "Lucia, we know this is overwhelming, but you're strong. You've already survived so much. Telling your story is part of taking back control. It's not easy, but it's important. Lucia bit her lip, her eyes filling with tears she didn't want to shed. She had never felt strong. She had spent her life shrinking, trying to disappear under the weight of her stepfather's control. But now, as the possibility of freedom dangled just out of reach, she realized that the only way forward was to fight for it. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice small but honest. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "Fear is normal, Lucia. But remember, you've already done the hardest part. You survived. Now it's about making sure he can never hurt you or anyone else again." There was a long silence. The weight of what lay ahead settled over her like a heavy blanket, but somewhere, buried deep beneath the fear, was a flicker of something else, a sense of purpose, perhaps, maybe even strength. Lucia nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Okay," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll do it." Bella and Mariana exchanged a look, a mix of relief and pride washing over their faces. "We'll be with you every step of the way," Mariana promised, squeezing Lucia's hand gently. "You're not alone." For the first time in what felt like forever, Lucia allowed herself to believe that. She wasn't alone. She had people who would stand by her, who would fight for her. And now, she would fight too. As the room settled into a quiet calm, Lucia glanced down at the baby in her arms. "Mike," she thought, drawing strength from his tiny presence. "I'm doing this for you." The decision had been made. After days of careful discussion, it was agreed that Lucia and baby Mike would move temporarily into Mrs. Rosie's home, is a safe, quiet place where they could begin to heal. Lucia had heard about Rosie before, a kind woman with a warm house who took in children like her. But the thought of leaving the hospital filled Lucia with a storm of emotions. She couldn't quite explain it. Relief, fear, and a strange flicker of hope all tangled together in her chest, making it hard to breathe. Relief that she and Mike would be safe, fear of the unknown, and hope, fragile but growing, that maybe things could be better. But leaving this place, leaving Mariana, was harder than she'd imagined. The door opened softly and Mariana entered the room, her face gentle as always. She sat beside Lucia, her presence grounding in a way that made Lucia feel just a little braver. "Are you ready?" Mariana asked, her voice quiet, as though she knew how overwhelming this moment was. Lucia nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Could anyone ever be ready to leave behind the only safety they've known? For weeks, this hospital had been her refuge. The soft hum of the machines, the kind smiles of the nurses, the late-night talks with Mariana. It had been a strange kind of family. "Rosie's a good woman," Mariana continued, sensing the hesitation. "She'll take care of you and Mike. You won't be alone." Lucia swallowed, the weight of her emotions pressing against her throat. She wanted to believe it. She had to believe it. But the fear still lingered. "Will you come visit?" Lucia's voice was small, almost childlike, as she looked up at Mariana. Mariana smiled, a gentle warmth in her eyes. "Of course. You can call me any time and I'll visit whenever I can. You'll never be alone, Lucia. I promise." Lucia nodded again, this time with more certainty. Mariana had been there from the beginning, the only adult she truly trusted. Knowing she wouldn't lose that connection gave her a sense of stability, like an anchor in the chaos of her life. Outside, Carmen was waiting by the nurse's station, holding a small stuffed bear in her hands. As Lucia and Mike approached, Carmen's face lit up with a bittersweet smile. She knelt down beside Lucia, offering her the bear. "For Mike," she said softly. "Something to remind him of us here." Lucia took the bear, her fingers brushing over its soft fur. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't know what else to say. The kindness from these women had carried her through the darkest days, and now they were sending her off into a new chapter. It was overwhelming. Mariana and Carmen helped Lucia gather the few belongings she had: the small bag of clothes, the baby blanket, and now the bear. There was a sweetness to the moment, like the final scenes of a movie where everything comes to a soft, emotional close. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Mariana bent down, pressing a kiss to Lucia's forehead. "You're going to be okay. Just take it one day at a time." Lucia nodded, her heart too full for words. She turned toward the elevator where Mrs. Rosie was waiting, her hands folded gently in front of her, a welcoming smile on her face. Rosie had the kind of warmth that made Lucia's chest loosen just a little. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be so bad. With Mike held securely in her arms, Lucia stepped into the elevator beside Rosie. She cast one last glance at Mariana and Carmen, their figures growing smaller as the doors slid shut. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it away quickly. This wasn't the time for crying. As they exited the hospital, the sun hit Lucia's face, warm and bright, as if the world outside had been waiting for her. She held Mike tighter, feeling his small breath against her chest, and in that moment something shifted inside her. The fear was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but there was also hope, a fragile, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, this new life would be better. Lucia walked toward the car with Rosie by her side, stepping into a future that felt uncertain but possible. It wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead would be long and hard. But for the first time in a long time, Lucia wasn't walking it alone. The house was different than anything Lucia had ever known. It wasn't big, not like the houses she'd seen in magazines or on TV, but it had a warmth about it. The pale yellow walls of the living room, the creaky wooden floors, and the scent of lavender that seemed to hang in the air, all of it made the space feel safe. There was a fireplace in the corner, though it hadn't been used in months, and a large window that overlooked a garden that stretched out into the horizon. Lucia stood near the front door, clutching Mike in her arms. He was asleep, his tiny fists curled against her chest, and she found comfort in the rhythm of his breathing. Mrs. Rosie, the woman who had taken them in, was busy in the kitchen, humming softly as she moved about. The clatter of dishes and the occasional hum of the stove were the only sounds filling the otherwise quiet home. "You hungry, sweetheart?" Mrs. Rosie called from the kitchen, her voice gentle yet firm. "I'm making some soup. Thought you might like that." Lucia nodded, though she wasn't sure if Mrs. Rosie could see her from where she stood. She hadn't spoken much since they arrived. The words seemed stuck in her throat, like they didn't belong to her anymore. But even in her silence, she felt something different here. It wasn't like before. The fear wasn't as sharp. The walls didn't feel like they were closing in. Mrs. Rosie appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked at Lucia with kind, knowing eyes. "You don't have to be afraid here," she said softly. "This is your home now, for as long as you need it to be." Lucia blinked and glanced down at Mike, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket wrapped around him. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake. "He's all I have," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And he's safe," Mrs. Rosie replied, stepping closer. "You both are. No one's going to take him away from you." It was a promise, one Lucia wanted desperately to believe. But trust didn't come easily anymore, not after everything she had been through. The memories still clung to her, sharp and painful, like shards of glass she couldn't shake loose. She had learned not to rely on anyone, not even her own family, especially not them. But here, in this house, there was something different. Mrs. Rosie wasn't rushing her to speak or pushing her to do things she wasn't ready for. She simply let Lucia be, offering gentle words when needed, but giving her space when she saw the girl wasn't ready. And for the first time in a long time, Lucia felt like she could breathe, even if it was just a little. The days passed slowly. Each one was a new challenge, learning to trust Mrs. Rosie, letting herself feel safe, even for a moment. Mike kept her grounded. His cries for food, his soft coos, the way he clung to her when he slept, were all reminders that she had to keep going, that there was someone who needed her. Every day Mrs. Rosie would invite Lucia to join her in the garden. "Come on, sweetheart," she'd say. "The sun's shining, the flowers need tending. Fresh air will do you good." At first, Lucia would sit in the shade, watching from a distance as Mrs. Rosie pulled weeds, planted new seeds, or pruned the roses. Slowly, though, she began to help. She'd kneel beside Mrs. Rosie, her hands in the soil, feeling the earth beneath her fingertips. There was something calming about it, something that made the weight on her chest a little lighter. In the background, the legal proceedings continued. Lucia didn't know much about the details. Mrs. Rosie and the lawyers shielded her from most of it, only telling her what she needed to know. Her stepfather had been arrested, her mother's whereabouts still unclear. They told her it would take time, that justice would come. But for now, all she needed to do was focus on healing. Healing. It was a word that felt foreign to her, like it belonged to someone else. But here, in the quiet of Mrs. Rosie's house, with the garden blooming around her and Mike growing stronger every day, Lucia began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was possible. She found small moments of joy helping Mrs. Rosie in the kitchen, rocking Mike to sleep, watching the sunset from the porch. They were simple things, but they filled her days with a peace she hadn't known before. And slowly, that peace began to turn into hope. Lucia still had a long way to go. The wounds were deep, the pain still raw. But in Mrs. Rosie's home, surrounded by warmth and care, she began to believe that maybe one day she could be whole again. And for the first time, the future didn't seem so scary. It seemed possible. Thank you for sticking with me until the end of this story. It's truly been an emotional journey as we followed Lucia, a young girl who has faced so much trauma at such a young age. Through every detail of the story, I hope you could feel her pain, her fear, but also the strength she found in her bond with Mike and the support from people like Mariana. The most important thing is that Lucia is still fighting, and though her journey ahead is not easy, there's always hope. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on the upcoming content. Every story I bring to you is a chance for us to reflect on the important things in life, love, loss, and the strength to overcome adversity. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video.